teach off of good notes, so I use good notes. So I'm playing around with the contrast all the time. So this is a blue with a silver pen, but let me know what you think. So we have a light bulb. Okay? We have a light bulb plugged into a lamp on the wall. Okay? That light bulb has a cord. This cord goes in and you plug it into the wall, right? That's the pathway of electricity. Hopefully everyone knows what this does. Okay? We plug it into the wall. Now, there's a wire that goes from that wall all the way to the breaker box in your house. It's usually in your garage or someplace. If you don't know where your breaker box is, look for it. We're in hurricane season, so powers may go out and off, so make sure you know where that is. We have the breaker box of the house, and then we also have what feeds the power to your house from an electrical company. So it's Duke Energy or whatever it is. So this is the pathway of you getting electricity to your lamp. So you're going to go study tonight, and you turn on the light in your room, and the lamp doesn't turn on. So where's the problem? Is it the bulb? Is it the wire going to the outlet that's bad? Is it so the outlet doesn't work? So I can plug in anything I want, nothing's going to work? Is the breaker box, is the power out to my entire house? So does any light turn on? Is the power out to the whole neighborhood? Nothing's going to work. That's the job in physiology, is to figure out where in the pathway that went on. Make sense? So that's how you start thinking about things when it comes to how we learn physiology. So, like I said to the PA group, I'll tell you guys about AA. The summer is learning the language of medicine, how to speak medically with the right words and understanding what it means. When you guys join a new sport or learn a new game or whatever, you have to learn the vocabulary of the sport or you won't know what you're doing. Same thing with medicine. You have to learn the vocabulary of medicine. Knowing, and a great way to test yourself on this, watch drug commercials. When they rattle off all the side effects, they go real fast. Right now, you're going to hear that. It's going to sound like mumble jumble the whole way through. You know, all those words, like, what do they even mean? As in a year from now, watch that same commercial. You're going to pick up on everything because everything's slowed down because you understand the language of medicine. You understand what they're talking about when they rattle off that fast. So look at drug commercials, you'll figure it out. So homeostasis, that's the whole point of physiology, is maintaining homeostasis. So what we're learning this whole semester, we're going to talk about homeostasis. For every single system has a certain parameter that they're in charge of. So maintaining homeostasis, when things get abnormal, our body, in order to maintain homeostasis, has to do some abnormal things. Okay? Diabetes is a perfect example. We want to maintain glucose between 80 and 100, 60 to 100, whatever. That's the homeostatic range for glucose. When we eat garbage and all the sugar stuff, sugar goes up. We have to take care of that. So how do we take care of it? With insulin to drop it back down. But if you continue to eat bad, that insulin still gets secreted all the time. So you have an abnormal response to keep something in a homeostatic range. And that's where the pathophysiology comes in when we get to the fall, about the diseases. So all we're trying to do is figure out how we can maintain homeostasis. Here's an example of all the different systems and their involvement in maintaining blood pressure. Just blood pressure. By the end of this course, you'll know all this stuff. Yes. Cardiovascular controls the rate of the blood flow and the resistance of our vessels. That will maintain blood pressure. GI system, your fluid and your salt intake. That's going to alter your blood pressure. Renal system, what can we excrete out of our system to lower our pressure? That's where diuretics come in. They remove blood volume, lowering your pressure, by having the kidneys start excreting a ton. Nervous system, regulating your appetite and your thirst. all going into your blood pressure management. Endocrine, together with nervous system, has a lot of integration, aldosterone for blood pressure management. So again, maintaining this stable environment with all these different parameters just to maintain your blood pressure. So as we go through all the different systems, we'll keep bringing this up. So the way that we maintain control in our system is always with negative feedback control. We do have a few episodes in our body or systems or processes that are positive feedbacks. There's not many, but there are a few that are positive feedback. Anyone know which ones are positive? Pregnancy is one. Blood clotting. Platelet activation is another positive feedback loop so you can stop bleeding. Those are a couple of them. So these are some main variables that you guys are going to get very familiar with through your time in school. You don't need to memorize these, but become comfortable with these values and these ranges as you go through your programs. Also a tip, keep or just have access to a medical terminology book. Now is not the time to be shy. If you don't know what a word means, look it up. It's going to come up at some point. You have to know these words. So always go to that medical terminology. So we have our set point value. We have a normal range. So glucose, we want it to be around 90 as a set point, but we have a range that it could be a part of. Core body temp, sodium, potassium, calcium. These are all things that we want to keep in certain ranges because when they get out of range, physiological processes won't work as well anymore. So we want to keep everything within this range. So the negative feedback is to keep everything controlled. So when we have a negative feedback, we have to define a couple of terms when it comes to how it all works. So negative feedbacks are our major controls. So we have a set point. This is the center or, not really. Hang on. Okay, so we have the set point. What do we want the value to be? So before we had that table, glucose was 90. That's our set point for glucose. Then we have to have a sensor or a receptor. What's going to pick this up? Okay, right now it's all warm in here. What is our receptor? We have a thermometer in the room or somewhere. It's going to tell you what the temperature of the room is. So that is your sensor. We have a thermometer. And when that gets to a certain temperature, we have a comparator. So we have it in your house. You have your AC set for 76. You have a thermometer is your sensor. Our set point is 76. So that's the comparator. We want to be 76. So if our sensor is reading 77, it's too warm for what we want it to be for our set point. So we have to kick in an effector. In this case, in this example, the effector is to kick on the air conditioning to bring the temperature back down. Once the temperature comes back down to that set point, we've reached homeostasis again, and the system shuts off. It's a negative feedback. It provides control so that nothing goes rampant and goes wild. So those are the different parts of a negative feedback. And here's another way to schematically look at it. That we have our, I'll blow this up a little bit. Okay, we have our variable. It could be temp, glucose, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Then we have our receptor for that variable, looking for changes in that variable. Then we have our control center. Okay, looking at the reference point, checks it against it, and then we're going to make adjustments, and that's where our effector comes into play. And here's just another example. In this case, they're looking at okay, so body temperature. So right now we're all a little bit warm. We have thermoreceptors that sense that on our skin. Sends signals to the hypothalamus. That's our comparator. Hypothalamus sets the set point for our temperature for our body. And if we are cold, or too low, our body has to warm ourselves up. So we start to muscle shiver. That shivering produces heat. That will warm us up. Blood vessels constrict to get blood away from our extremities that we don't need. So the nice warm blood comes in our core and warms us up. So again, we have our set point, our range, and our effect. What's going to happen when it gets out of range. So some clinical correlations, I'll throw these in periodically to kind of reinforce something we just learned. And in this case, again, I mentioned before about diabetes. These pathologic states happen when homeostasis can't be maintained anymore. We eat too much sugar, sugar rises too much, we have too much glucose, we have to get rid of it, insulin has to go up, and you can burn out those beta cells. So again, this is an example of how dysregulation can cause problems. I gotta throw some memes in there. Okay. So our internal environment. One of the goals is to maintain a great fluid system to allow for great transport of materials, exchange of gases, excretion of these gases, all has to be done in this internal environment. We have two components of body fluid. We have everything that's either within a cell, our intracellular fluid, or everything outside the cell, the extracellular fluid. Our extracellular fluid is made up of two things, plasma and your interstitial fluid. So stuff that's within the tissues and our plasma in our blood is the extracellular component versus the intracellular component. Now, with our intracellular fluid, you have to start associating concentrations of these ions. So inside the cell, we have low, let me change that. Low potassium, low sodium, high potassium, and low chloride. This is intracellular. This is inside the cell. This is important. We're going to talk about charges and movement of these ions, which generate action potentials that allow us to do everything we need to do. Protein doesn't matter so much here. So just they're there. I'll mention protein in a second, why it's different when we talk about protein. So intracellular fluid, low sodium, high potassium, low chloride. Interstitial fluid, and then we have our blood plasma. In the interstitial fluid, or outside the cell, high sodium, low potassium, high chloride, and very, very important is that you don't want any protein at all in the intracellular fluids. Okay, we don't want any proteins there. When we get to those sections, we'll talk more about why it's important, but it has to do with our fluid and edema formation. We don't want proteins in the interstitial fluid. So just remember that for now. We'll come back to it at some point. And then we have our blood concentrations as well. Relatively the same between the two as far as concentrations. They aren't pretty much, they can mix back and forth pretty easily. So the extracellular or interstitial fluid in your blood plasma, your extracellular fluid compartment, are relatively similar concentrations of these ions. But just remember, inside the cell, low sodium, high potassium, low chloride. So internal environment, free exchange of water and solutes in that ECF. That's why they're very similar in concentration in the ECF. And in contrast, again, between interstitial and intracellular is highly regulated. We don't want everything just going into your cells. We have to have some sort of protection there to limit what can get in and what can get out. And we do that with these plasma cell membranes. Okay, so compartment makeup. Total body water is about 60% body weight in men, 50% body weight in women is just water. Of the total amount of water that we have in our body, 60% is in our cells, inside the cells, 40% is in our extracellular fluid compartment, blood, plasma, and interstitial. Of the total amount of ECF, the volume doesn't matter, just whatever the volume of our ECF is, 80% is within our interstitial space and 20% is in our plasma. So these are the two things I mentioned before as far as our ECF. Remember, extracellular fluid outside the cell, high in sodium and chloride, low in potassium. Start getting that drilled in your head now with these concentrations because it dictates the movement of these ions and you know which way the electricity goes. Intracellularly, inside the cell, high potassium, low sodium and chloride. Interstitial fluid is similar. The big difference is no protein in the interstitial fluid. And we also measure osmolarity, which is the concentration of solute in the solution. The higher the osmolarity, the more solutes are in the solution. I'll give you an example in a minute of like Kool-Aid. If you have a glass of water and you put 1 scoop of it in there, it may turn very, very light red because there's not a lot of mix that you put in there. There's not a lot of solute in that solvent, which is the water. If you add 2 more scoops, you're adding a ton more solute. The concentration gets stronger, higher amount of solute, and the color gets deeper and deeper red. So you know there's more stuff inside it. So we talk about more dilute, we're watering it down. When we talk about more concentrated, it's getting darker red. There's more solutes taking up the space. Here's another one for you. Okay, so let's talk about how we move stuff around. Membrane transports are basically just doors. They open in certain directions. Some may require you to actually give energy and push the door open. Some may just open up when you walk up to it. But again, it comes down to energy source. Does it require energy or not? And also, what is going on? Are these just one molecule going in and out? Are they exchanging? What's going on? So we have to exchange with our the fluid. The type of membrane transport dictates its function. So a lot of the things that we learn in physiology is all about the function. The anatomy is the structure of the system, whatever you're looking at, and the physiology is how does it function. So think about it that way. The structure of our hand allows us to do certain things. The way that our body is made allows us to do certain things as well. So it dictates its function. Excitable tissues. If they're excitable, that means it has to be some voltage going on, some changes going on. So we need some voltage sensitive membranes. What does that mean? When that voltage of that cell membrane hits certain numbers, certain gates will open up. Certain gates will close. They're voltage gated. Whatever that voltage is, some mechanisms will open, some will close. And you'll see how we go through an exponential, why everything happens the way that it does. So the transport of the solute is categorized based on the energy. So active transport uses ATP. Easy way to remember this. If you're pushing a ball up a hill, it's going against the gradient. It requires energy to do that. That's why it's important to know the concentrations. So sodium, where is sodium highest? Inside the cell or outside the cell? Inside. Sodium is high inside the cell. Inside or outside? Sodium. Outside. Sodium is outside the cell. So if all gates were open for sodium, which way will sodium want to go based off its concentration gradient? Inside the cell. Okay, it's a high concentration outside. When you open those gates, sodium's going to rush inside. that doesn't require energy because it's going down the gradient. Now, to reset our cells, we have to get that sodium out. We can't let it stay inside. We have to get it out of our system, out of the cell. We have to push it back outside to put those gradients back in place. To do that, you have to push sodium against the gradient, right? You're going against, the majority of the sodium is outside. We want to get outside again. So we have to go against the gradient. It requires energy. So whenever you see the ATP ACE at the end of a pump, it's going against the gradient because it's got to pump the solute against the gradient. So primary is directly coupled with ATP. Secondary active transport is two solutes moving together. So one will be going out, one could be coming in, and just that energy provides enough spin to get that channel working without ATP, but it's still requiring some energy of movement. And then if you have passive transport, they don't require ATP at all. So here's one way of looking at it. Looking at it from top down and the bottom up. Top down is looking at the energy requirement. Does it require energy or not? And we have our passive and you have your active. Passive transport is just your simple diffusion or your facilitated diffusion. Basically, you just have a pore or a membrane and the solid can get through. But it requires some sort of membrane spanning protein to get through. Then you have your active side, and obviously they're going to require ATP. There's your primary, and then you also have endocytosis and exocytosis. Those do require some sort of energy to do those things. And that's how we either expel large quantities of something or we can ingest large molecules. So like phagocytosis is a form of endocytosis where we're engulfing debris and bringing it inside the cell. When we release neurotransmitters, okay, that is exocytosis, and that requires calcium to do that, to get your neurotransmitters released. Okay. So we have some drugs. They're called, so the drugs that we give also use these transport mechanisms. So the anesthetic gases that we use, they are lipid soluble. Okay, what is the membrane that we have surrounding all of our cells? The phospholipid bilayer. Okay, it's a fat molecule, lipid. Lipid only lets lipids through easily. Anesthetic gases are all lipid soluble. They go right through. They don't require any type of transport. They just go right through. And they also allow diffusion to the brain that allows your anesthetic gases to work. Diuretics are going through the bloodstream, but then they get secreted out into our kidneys to provide that diuretic effect as well. These clinical correlations won't be on your exams. They're just to reinforce things. If it's an important one, I will tell you this is a very important one. Make sure you know this one. These are just examples. So here's our primary active transports. First one, the most important one, the sodium potassium ATPase pump. These are all require energy because they have ATP in it. So these require energy to do. So what this does is it pumps 3 sodiums out and allows 2 to come right back in. Okay. So it's an exchanger. Pops 3 sodiums out, brings 2 potassiums in. The 2 potassiums coming in, is that going against the gradient for potassium or with the gradient? Against. Potassium is high inside the cell. It's low outside the cell. So we're bringing 2 potassiums in, it's going against the gradient. It requires energy. This sodium potassium ATPase pumps is responsible for getting our cells back to baseline so that another active potential can happen again. This is the pump responsible. There are thousands of these things all over every single cell. Don't think there's just one pump for every cell. It's going on constantly, getting those concentrations back to normal so another action potential can occur. We also have a calcium ATPase pump. These are located in the plasma membrane in our endoplasmic reticulum. We only need calcium mainly for two things. And in this course, the only two things I want you to remember are calcium. Calcium is mainly used for contraction. Muscle contraction requires calcium to do it. And exocytosis. Those are the two major things that we use calcium for in our body that we're going to talk about a lot in this class. Muscle contraction and exocytosis. So we don't want calcium levels high a lot. We want to have them out when we need it and then put it back into its little storage locations so we don't have constant contractions. We want to have a relaxation and then a contraction. If we can't get rid of the calcium or we have constant calcium, we're going to have constant contraction. If we have contraction, especially of our heart, if our heart is squeezing harder because of excess calcium, what do you think is going to happen to your blood pressure? It's going to go up. So there's a class of drugs that we give for blood pressure. They're called calcium channel blockers. Everyone heard of calcium channel blockers? What do you think they're doing? Now we know what calcium does. So if I give you a calcium channel blocker, I am blocking the amount of calcium that you can have. Therefore, your contraction gets reduced, thereby lowering your blood pressure. Do you see how you go step by step by step when you're reading this stuff and you're learning it? Like, when it comes to this stage of the game with studying, it doesn't matter how silly you look, whatever stupid mnemonics you can remember to remember this stuff. Get familiar with mnemonics. Easily remember things. Again, it can be as silly as you want, as long as you remember it. It doesn't matter. So there's a ton of mnemonics. Just type in anatomy mnemonics for any system or whatever. There's stuff out there already for all these things. So that's what the calcium ATPase does. Okay, we also have a hydrogen potassium ATPase. This is hydrogen out of the cell to bring potassium back into the cell. These are located in our acidic gastric juices in the stomach. Okay, so Okay, is everyone back? So as I go through these different pumps, you don't have to memorize them right now. We're going to go through them more in detail as we go through different areas, just emphasizing that, again, these require energy, kind of give a little bit about what they are. The last thing I'll say about this hydrogen potassium ATPase pump is because it's dumping hydrogens into the gastric juices, which provides the hydrogen for the hydrochloric acid, which is what our stomach acid is. So if you have acid reflux, too much acid production in the stomach, what's one of the drugs that we give you for acid production? There's two of them. Proton pump inhibitor. What is a proton? Hydrogen. So the proton pump inhibitor just blocks that. So you don't produce as much hydrogen into the gastric juices, so that it's not as acidic. So that's an example of another drug that we give, proton pump inhibitors, to prevent hydrogen. It shuts down this pump, so it doesn't work. So you get less hydrogen. There's another hydrogen ATPase one. This deals with lysosomes. This is just breaking down cells. And we have these multi-drug resistance transporters, and they extrude actual molecules from the cells itself. These are in the liver, kidney, blood-brain barrier. They actually will take the actual molecule, bring it into the transporter, that protein, and then shove the entire molecule outside the cell somewhere else. So those are also used for cancer drugs. These are secondary active transport. These are co-transporters or symporters. So two solutes in the same direction is a co-transport. In the stomach and the intestines, we have a glucose and sodium. They both go together. In the kidneys, we have these triple transporters or duo transporters. Again, all three or all two of those molecules have to be present in that co-transporter, or the whole thing doesn't work. So all three have to be there. We have exchangers, also known as antiporters. These are two solutes in opposite directions. So we have a sodium-calcium exchange. We have a sodium-hydrogen exchange. And obviously, negative feedbacks. We want to maintain low intracellular calcium and hydrogen. So this is just another graphical way of showing what we just talked about. And another way of learning, remember, if it requires ATP, it's active transport, requires energy to go against the gradient. And we have our internal receptors. Here's that calcium and hydrogen exchanger to maintain our intracellular calcium stores. We can sequester it there. And we have our co-transporters and symporters, opposite direction, or they go in the same direction. Passive transport. needs a couple of things to happen. We need a favorable electro and a chemical gradient. So we've already talked about concentration gradients as that how it moves things from high concentration to low concentration. But one thing we haven't talked about is the charge. These are ions. They're positively charged. Chloride is negatively charged. But they have a charge to them. So as they're moving, we're going to get changes in our electrical activity. So the chemical is just the concentration gradient. The electrical part is looking at the charge. As sodium starts going into the cell, when the doors open up for sodium, sodium wants to go in what direction? In the cell or out of the cell? In. Wants to go in. What charge is sodium? Positive. What charge is the inside of the cell at rest? Negative. So we have the chemical gradient favoring going into the cell. We have the electrical gradient also favoring sodium to go into the cell. Because it's positive, it's going towards a negative. But what happens as all these positive ions start going inside the cell? What happens to the charge inside the cell now? Becomes more positive or becomes less negative. Okay, becomes less negative or becomes more positive. They both mean the same thing. As that electrical gradient starts to change inside, become more positive, eventually sodium's not going to move anymore because it's going to meet its electrical and chemical gradient equal points. So at some point, we're going to meet our electrical chemical gradient equalizer, whatever, and there's going to be no more movement of that ion. Everyone good so far? Let's talk about sodium. Potassium does the same thing. Chloride does the same thing. So the diffusion either goes through that lipid bilayer. If it's what kind of molecule? Lipid soluble. If it's lipid soluble, it can diffuse right through that membrane because it's a phospholipid bilayer, like dissolves like, and it goes right through. Or via pores in the channels in the membrane. That's how you can get these molecules through with these membrane-spanning proteins. And they are the pores that allow for transport to happen. So, Fick's law of diffusion states there's a net flux per unit area is a factor of permeability of the solute. Can the solute even get through the wall, the cell membrane? Can it get in? If it's a water soluble, it's not getting through the membrane. It's got to get through a transport mechanism. Is there a transport mechanism for this ion? That's what we're talking about, permeability. If there is a membrane transport for this ion, is it open? Is the gate even open? So these are the things that when we go through a generation of an action potential, these are the things that are going to pop up. So is it permeable is one factor. The next one, the concentration difference between across the membrane. So we're looking at the electrical gradient and the chemical. They both have to favor movement, and you'll get movement in that direction. So passive transport, permeability is the main thing when it comes to passive transport. You have to be permeable. If the doors aren't open, it doesn't matter what the gradient is. All of us are inside, none of us are outside, but if that door is locked, we're not getting outside. Even though we want to go outside, it's hot in here. We can't because the doors are locked. That's what we're talking about, permeability. So, membrane permeability is proportional to the lipid solubility of the solute. The more lipid soluble, the more permeable it is. We're good there. And inversely proportional to the size of the molecule. So inversely proportional. The bigger the molecule, the harder it is to get through that membrane. What molecule is very big that floats around in our blood? They're big molecules. They shouldn't go anywhere else but in the blood. They can go around. Lymphocytes can move around. Proteins. Proteins are big molecules. Remember I said you do not want any protein in certain areas. Normally they won't because proteins are bigger than the pore. Proteins can't get through because they're too big. So when people get kidney damage, the filters get broken. So bigger molecules can pass through. And that's why when people have kidney damage, they get protein in the urine. Protein should never be there because they're not permeable. It's too big. They won't get through. So let's talk about size. The size matters. So transport of ions and other small water-soluble solutes requires proteins. And the most common one are these ion channels. So ion-gated channels. You're going to hear this a lot. They are made for the ions, sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, so forth. They have a pore region, and that's where the actual ion will diffuse. So if you have here's our phospholipid bilayer, here's our protein, this is the pore. And the width of that dictates the size of the molecule that can get through that pore. So there are certain widths in those things. Obviously, the way I'm drawing it is very rudimentary, but you can get the idea. Selectivity filter. Certain ions and certain gates are only there for certain ions. They are selective. Okay, so you'll have sodium gated channels, potassium channels. They are only specific for that ion, nothing else. And the gating mechanism opens and closes the channels. When the gate is wide open, you get flow down the gradient. So as long as the door is open, everything's going to move. Some channels have an inactivated state. Okay, sodium channel has an inactivation gate. It's open wide, but when a certain voltage criteria is met, the inactivation gate pops in and kind of shuts down movement of sodium. We also have voltage gated. Talk about membrane potential, the voltage that we have across the membrane. As that changes up and down, voltage will activate or close certain gates as well. They're called voltage gated channels. As the voltage goes up and down, the channels open and close. We also have chemical or ligand-gated channel. That means a molecule has to sit in that receptor, then the door opens. So it's a ligand-gated channel. You need a molecule to sit in the receptor first, and that will then open the door. So it's a ligand-gated. You need a ligand or a molecule or a drug or something to sit in that receptor and open the door for you. The last one are these mechanical forces, and these are stretch activated. One example is your bladder. Okay, your bladder changes the shape and it stretches depending on the amount of volume of liquid that's in your bladder. As it starts to stretch even more, you're stretching these receptors, different chemicals are coming in to stimulate your brain. Hey, your bladder is getting full, you might want to go to the bathroom pretty soon. And the longer that you wait, that stronger that intensity gets because the bladder is being stretched more of whatever is being activated is being able to get through because we have stretched out our receptors, and it tells our brain, hey, you got to go to the bathroom. So let's do a little bit of, actually, we're going to skip this for now because we'll go back to this in a different slide. So we'll skip this for now, but you have the real one in your notes in Canvas to fill all that in. Passive transport has a uniport, some of them, binds a solute on one side, and it delivers through the other side. So here's our membrane. Here is our membrane spanning protein. And a molecule will sit there, and work its way all the way through and then spit out at the other side. It's the same molecule, it doesn't go through any changes, it just goes through the entire protein. So facilitated diffusion is obviously going to be faster than simple because it's using a transporter. So these are transports, they grab it from one side and they bring it inside the cell. These GLUT transporters, glucose transporters, do this. They take the actual molecule of glucose and will bring it inside the cell. Okay, so that's passive transport. Vesicular transport, these are macromolecule transports. These are big size. So endocytosis, you're bringing it in. Okay, so pinocytosis, phagocytosis, whatever. Then you have your exocytosis, so you're exporting of solute out of the cell. Okay, and that's your exocytosis. We have a disease called Lambert-Eaton syndrome. This is your clinical correlation. This will not be on your test, but again, showing you how blocking these channels can cause a lot of problems. So in Lambert-Eaton, they have these autoantibodies that bind to and block calcium channels. So we're not having any calcium to do anything. So remember, there's two things that calcium is needed for: contraction and exocytosis. So in this case, we're blocking the calcium channels, so they're not going to do anything. So if calcium isn't going to do anything, the neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, will not be released into that synaptic cleft. So therefore, you have nothing to activate your muscles, and you get weak muscles that way. So by blocking calcium, prevents all that stuff from happening. Botox, same thing. Botox prevents the release of acetylcholine. If you can't have acetylcholine, you can't have a muscle contraction. If muscles don't contract, you don't get wrinkles in your forehead, right? And that's how that works. So there's your clinical correlation for that. Osmosis, obviously we're doing a lot with osmosis. We're giving fluids all the time. They're all based in water or saline, essentially. So we have to understand how osmosis works as well. Because obviously all the IV fluid, all that stuff. Water transport is always passive, okay? So driven either by the diffusion gradient, again, high concentration to low concentration, or the hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted by the water or the fluid itself. So you all have a glass and cups in with you and your water. Your water is exerting hydrostatic pressure against the wall of your container. Because the wall of your container is rigid, the water is going to occupy that space. If you had a plastic bag and you put water in there, the hydrostatic pressure of the water is going to push out on the bag, and then the bag is going to fall, whatever, because there's no support there. That's what water does. So hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted by the fluid. We're going to talk about that a lot. So if there's more blood in an area, for instance, I'll say this a lot. If you want to see any pathology, look at anything, you want to see stuff, just go to Disney, just sit there and just watch people walk by. Look at their ankles, you'll see everything. Okay? When people have lower extremity edema from whatever the reason is, they have accumulation of blood in their legs, that is increasing the hydrostatic pressure of the blood in your legs that is pushing out. So the hydrostatic pressure is always pushing out. If you stand for long periods of time, the blood is always in your legs, so it's pushing out. That's why people have venous insufficiency. At the end of the day, the legs are swollen because all the hydrostatic pressure pushes it out, the fluid out, because water can go freely, water eventually will be pushed out. So that's how you get swelling in your legs. Hydrostatic pressure is too much, it pushes fluid out. So osmosis is water movement driven by a concentration gradient. And we express it in terms of solute concentration. So how many solutes are in the concentration? So that's our osmolarity. The higher the osmolarity, the more stuff is in there. A normal milliosmolarity is about 280. You don't need to know that for right now. That's about a normal number, 280 to 320. That means in those cases, there's 300 units of a solute in that person's blood at that time. Okay? So this is where I talk about the Kool-Aid. Dilute, concentrated. Dilute only has 2 solutes in it, but the more concentrated, you see there's a lot more solutes in that concentration, in that solvent. So more concentrated. When we get to the renal system, we're going to talk about the concentration or dilution of the blood in relation to the concentration and dilution of the urine. So it's very important to understand concentration in one, what happens in the other one. So we'll get to all that as we go. But again, this whole first lecture, that we'll cover today and on Thursday, just setting the stage, they're just definitions. Learn the words, what they mean. So like I said before, osmolarity, the amount of solutes in a concentration. 1 mole of glucose is 1 mole or 1 osmolarity. Glucose is a molecule, it doesn't dissociate in water, so it just stays as 1. But salt, sodium chloride, is 2 milliosmoles because it breaks up into sodium and a chloride. So that's the only really difference. We also want to relate the osmolarity to a reference. So how do I know that your osmolarity is this high or is it low compared to something else? So when we talk about isoosmotic, those are 2 solutions with the same osmolarity. Will there be any movement of water in an isoosmotic fluid? Nope. Concentrations are equal on both sides. There's going to be no movement of water. Everything's great. If we say a solution is hyperosmotic, that means that the solution with the greater osmolarity than a reference. What is the osmolarity, or what is the percentage, put that way, of the sodium chloride, the salt in our blood? Anyone know what the percentage? You worked in the ER, you order fluids for someone. So normal saline is 0.9%. So normal saline, 0.9%. So if I'm going to give you a hyperosmotic solution, our reference is 0.9%. So if I'm giving you something that's hyperosmotic to that, what's an example of what percent I would have to give you? 1%, 2%. They do have these concentrations available, like 2% normal saline is going to be a hyperosmotic solution. A hypoosmotic solution is a solution with lower osmolarity than the reference. And in this case, it could be half NS, which would be 0.45% sodium chloride. Okay, this matters when you're giving fluids to a patient, because I think it's on this slide. Where is it? Maybe it's later. So, in a hyperosmotic solution, let me just add a new page. So this is a hyperosmotic solution. We have, let me erase this. 2% in there, and we have 0.9% inside the cell. So we're giving someone 2% solution. Which way is the water going to go? So we have outside the cell and we have inside the cell. Which way is the water going to go? Outside the cell, right? Why is it going to go outside the cell? To dilute out the higher concentrated side. So let's say the solute can't go between the membrane, but water can. So water is going to leave the cell and it's going to go outside. So what's going to happen to the cells when you give a hyperosmotic solution? They're going to shrink. Okay? Cells are going to shrink by giving a hyperosmotic solution. If someone's got brain swelling, cerebral edema, yes, give them 2% solution because it's going to pull that water out of those swollen cells. That's one reason you would give a 2% solution. If they had severe cerebral swelling, you want to get that stuff down. Now, let's look at a hypo solution. Okay, so there is our membrane. We have 0.9% inside the cell. And outside the cell, we're giving a hypoosmotic solution. So let's say that is 0.45% outside the cell, but inside the cell is 0.9%. If you give someone a hypoosmotic solution, which way is that water going to go? Inside the cell. And what's going to happen to the cell in this case? And this swells. So if someone's severely dehydrated, you can give like a 0.45 fluid and help facilitate pushing water into the cell. So this is where osmolarity comes into play, very important. Fluid management, what kind of fluid are you going to order for that patient? All matters because you have to know your reference. And the reference for the body is 0.9% salt. So this is talking about our hydrostatic forces. Okay, so we can convert osmolarity to units of pressure. Oh, that's why. There we go. To be combined gives fluid across capillaries. So if you put a little probe on one end of a mechanism, you have water set up. We have a semi-permeable membrane that does not allow the solutes to cross. So water wants to go in that direction. But if we had a little sensor there, we can pick up the amount of pressure the water is exerting to move across. And that's where we get this hydrostatic pressure from. So the more volume of fluid, blood or plasma or whatever, in an area with a semi-permeable membrane, water will exert a pressure, and it's called the hydrostatic pressure. We can estimate your plasma osmolarity just looking at three things: sodium, glucose, and your urea concentrations. Okay? When you calculate these things, it's called the osmolar gap. So these are the big things that are outside of the cells, right? Sodium is very high outside the cell. Glucose is high. Urea is a production byproduct. So that's going to be high as well in the plasma. So usually these three things will give us an estimate of what our osmolar gap is. Sometimes people have a gap. There's extra solutes there that shouldn't be there. And that usually happens ETOH intoxication and ethylene glycol. These are, again, this won't be on your test. Ethylene glycol is what? It's antifreeze, so sometimes people want to hurt themselves, they'll drink antifreeze. But when they come in, you do your labs, they're going to have this extra solutes floating around. Is it due to alcohol? Is it poisoning, ethylene glycol? Something else is there making your osmolarity go high. That's an osmolar gap. Effective osmolarity, because I talked about sodium, whenever you see the word tonicity, it's referring to sodium. Okay, so we use that one. That's why 0.9% is the reference. So we talk about hyperosmolar, hypoosmolar to the reference. The reference we always give is the salt. And because we're using salt as the reference, we call it tonicity. So when you see tonicity, it has to do with salt. Something's going to have to do with salt. So again, isotonic solution, isotonic, referencing the salt, but we know it's isotonic, isoosmotic, means the same thing. It's just that we're using salt as a reference, so it's tonicity. And we did this before. We give a hypotonic solution, so hypoosmotic, causes the cells to swell, and a hypertonic solution causes them to shrink. So make sure you understand that one and remember that one. And this we've already discussed, so we don't have to go over this. Okay, moving on to membrane potentials. So if you took a probe and you put inside versus outside the cell, there's going to be a resting membrane potential change, and the difference between the outside and the inside is about negative 74. So the inside is negative 74 millivolt units more negative than the outside of the cell is. So inside is negative, outside is positive at rest. Okay, mainly negative inside the cell. So membrane voltages are fundamental to the function of excitable tissues, nerves, muscle. They're excitable. Okay, your muscles will not work without excitation from a neurological source. They won't work. So they have to be excitable. So they can generate and propagate electrical signals, and we call them action potentials. Non-excitable cells are also affected by these membrane voltages because they contribute to the electrical chemical driving force for ion transport. So we're mainly going to be talking about muscle and nerves when it comes to these action potentials, but just know that the non-excitable ones, your organ tissue, they do have a little bit of a role with other things, but nerve and muscle are the big ones. So the movement of all these ions changes the membrane potential. We talked about before with these voltage-gated channels. That voltage-gated channel is going to be affected by this moving membrane potential with this action potential. So these voltage-gated channels are going to open and close depending on whatever's going on. So in this case, we are just really talking about potassium in this case for right now. So potassium is going to diffuse into the lower compartment down the concentration gradient. You see there's a ton of potassium out here, but very little potassium inside the cell, which is the way that it is. No, it's normally going outside the cell. In and out. So when potassium leaves the inside of the cell, what happens to the membrane potential? Does it become more negative or more positive? Just talking about potassium. More negative, right? Potassium, what kind of charge is that? Positive. Where are all these positive ions going? Outside the cell. So if all these positives are leaving, the cell membrane potential is going to come down and become more and more negative when potassium starts leaving. Membrane potential becomes more and more negative. As we go through everything together, it'll make sense. So equilibrium potential. I mentioned before that what are the two main driving factors for diffusion? Two things we're going to talk about. The chemical gradient and the electrical gradient, right? The two of those things are the main driving factors for permeability. Okay, concentration gradient we've already talked about. We know which way they're going to go. I said before in that example with sodium, if the sodium channels were wide open, sodium could do whatever it wanted, the concentration gradient favors to go in or out. In. The electrical gradient favors in or out for sodium. Sodium is a positively charged ion. The inside is negative, so sodium is going to go in. If you left sodium to its own devices to do whatever it wanted with that membrane potential, eventually sodium will even out at about plus 67. So you left sodium to do whatever it wanted. Eventually, sodium will stop moving, reach its equilibrium point when the membrane potential is plus 67. Do you need to memorize that number? No. It will make sense in a little bit. Some of the stuff that I talk about in class are kind of like building blocks to get you to understand what the main concept is. These are just building blocks to get you to where we have to go. So sodium left by itself wants to become very positive, right? Plus 67, that's where it wants to go. Next row, potassium. We just talked about potassium. So when potassium leaves, which way is potassium going? Inside the cell or outside the cell? Outside. But as it does that, more positive charges leaving the inside, right? So it's become more and more negative. So if you left potassium all by itself, you get negative 95 is where the membrane potential is going to be when potassium does its own thing. Okay, everyone good now? Sodium wants to shoot up to plus 60. Potassium by itself is going to go to negative 90 if left all by itself. The other ones don't worry about for now. You don't need to know the Nernst equation. Just showing you that if you left these things up to itself, this is what's going to happen. Now, our resting membrane potential, we said before, we took two probes, you put one inside the cell, one outside the cell, it's about negative 70 millivolts. So we can say that negative 70 is our normal membrane potential, when we call it VM. So at rest, nothing's happening in a cell, the membrane potential is going to be negative 70. Just remember that number, negative 70. The reason why it's negative 70, when you look at this equation, there are three ions that we're looking at. You do not need to memorize this equation. This is just showing you why potassium is so important. We have potassium, sodium, chloride. Those are the three ions that we always talk about. If you put all this into a formula, you get negative 70. That's the number for resting membrane potential. So keep that number in mind, and let's go back to these numbers. Sodium is plus 60, potassium is negative 95, and chloride is negative 89, but chloride doesn't really do much. So, which one is closest to negative 70? Potassium. And that is why potassium is the biggest component of the resting membrane potential. The concentration of sodium, of potassium, the concentration of potassium in your blood is going to affect your resting membrane potential and where you start. So, negative 70 is the normal one. Let's say, and I think it's this one. Yeah. So, hyperkalemia, potentially fatal condition where your serum potassium concentration goes up. Usually happens a lot in renal failure patients. People are on dialysis. They can't manage the potassium and it starts to rise up. If you change your serum potassium from 4.5, which is the normal one, to 9, which is really, really, really crazy, you'll change the membrane potential from negative 74 and it'll become more and more positive. This is the problem with potassium. With action potentials, we have a thing called threshold. Okay? This you have to know. And it's mentioned in a slide or two, but I want to mention it now because it's here. Threshold. When the action potential meets the threshold, you have an all or none principle. The whole thing starts. But once it's a slow rise, so let's say here is our millivolts, here is negative 50, negative 60, negative 70. Okay? Here's our normal rest. negative 70. Threshold is negative 50. When the membrane potential reaches negative 50, the whole active potential occurs and you have a stimulus or a beat. It transmits throughout the body, whatever. So normally, we're at negative 70. We have a pretty big margin there for threshold. Because if you get to threshold, if you think about it in a cardiac system, cardiac sense, if you get to threshold, you're going to have a beat. Your heart's going to beat. Whenever you get to threshold, the heart's going to beat. The easier it is to get to threshold, the easier it is to have a contraction or a beat or something. So by having this 20 millivolt difference at rest with normal concentrations, we have a little buffer there. So we don't get extra beats. A premature ventricular beat is a beat that should not be there because something happened that caused you to get to threshold. So now we're at negative 70 to negative 50. There's 20 units there to get to threshold before a beat is going to happen. If you change your concentration of potassium, our new resting membrane potential is now negative 60. You see how we're closer to threshold now? Because we are closer to the threshold, it is easier to get extra heartbeats in these cases. Okay, which is why it can trigger a fatal arrhythmia when you have altered potassium. This one you got to know. This clinical correlation, know this one. Potassium is very important. When you alter the concentration of potassium in the blood, you alter the resting membrane potential, which could put you to either coming closer to threshold or further away from threshold. So when we talk about stimulating something, we're going towards threshold. We're going to stimulate it. If we're going to inhibit something, do you want our membrane potential to be closer to threshold or further away from threshold? Further away from threshold. So how can we lower our membrane threshold? Okay, AA people, here you go. Let's go back to this right here. Here's chloride. Said we didn't do much with chloride, but this is where we want to. Look where chloride wants to go. Where does it want to go? Away from threshold or closer to threshold? Away. What's threshold? Negative 50 is threshold. The membrane potential is negative 70. If you left chloride to do whatever it wanted, that membrane potential is going to get more negative, making it harder to stimulate that cell. Anesthetic drugs, any type of sedating drugs, activates the chloride channels. And when you activate the chloride channels, chloride comes in, bringing the membrane potential to negative 80 to negative 90 to make it harder. Therefore, you're giving a drug to make them inhibited to do anything. That's where the chloride drugs come in. Okay, other definitions. Changes in membrane potential. Whenever we talk about depolarization, we're changing to less negative. That's why I said before, less negative or more positive. Either way, same thing. But in this case, we're becoming less negative. We're going from negative 70 to 0. We're becoming less negative. That's depolarization. Hyperpolarization. The membrane potential becomes more negative. So we're going lower than the baseline. What is our baseline membrane potential? Negative 70. So in hyperpolarization, we're going more negative than negative 70. So negative 80, negative 90. And then finally, we have repolarization. And that's returning of the membrane potential back to negative 70. So those are the three words. We're talking about depolarization, hyperpolarization, repolarization, and what ions are moving in each phase of these conditions. So, Excitable tissues, your neurons and muscles, respond to a stimulus by rapidly generating and propagating electrical signals. Okay, when you want to move your big toe, there's one long nerve, starts in the brain, goes all the way down, spinal cord, all the way down to about L1, L2, and then branches off and makes one other long nerve to go down to the big toe. So we have very, very long nerves. We have to propagate the signal long ways. So they are constant electrical signals that can be propagated over long distances without decay. Okay, you don't want that signal to be very strong at the top, and by the time it gets to the muscle that needs to be activated, the signal is so weak that it can't activate the muscle. So we need that strength, that propagation to be consistent without any decay. So we have this all or none principle, that once you hit threshold, all the channels open up. Everything goes all or none. Once you hit threshold, you can't stop it, which is why that resting memory potential is so important. Why you have to check labs on your patients when they come in with certain conditions, because if their potassium is out of whack, you got to correct that, because it can go into these bad heart rhythms. So once the threshold is exceeded, the phase of rapid depolarization will begin, and you get a peak of about 0 millivolts. So we go from negative 70 straight up to 0. Very, very fast. If there's a thing called overshoot, that just means anything above 0 millivolts. So if you go above, you call it overshoot. Not that big of a deal. But it's there, just in our definition, if you see it go above 0. Yes?
So once the threshold is reached, does it just keep contracting until...
So we'll get to that, what happens, but there's a couple phases. But yes, it will be all or none. But what happens is because we have these voltage-gated channels, now we're at 0 millivolts. Well, what gate do you think is going to open up at 0 millivolts? This is potassium gates open up at 0. And when potassium gates open up, which way is potassium going to go? Outside the cell. The cell is now 0 millivolts. What's going to happen when all this potassium leaves? We're going to go right back down to negative 70, negative 80, because that's where potassium wants to go. So we'll draw it all out. It'll make more sense. So action potentials are always due to fluctuations in sodium and potassium. That's it. Your action potentials, sodium and potassium. There is one case we'll learn about with the ear. It's a little bit different, but that's just the one case. When we get to the sensory stuff next week, we'll learn about that. So the first thing that happens, we have a rapid depolarization. Okay, after threshold is exceeded due to opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels. The voltage-gated sodium channels open up at around negative 70. So they're open. So the depolarization of the cell is always due to sodium. Okay, if you have a problem depolarizing your cell, it could be due to sodium. Okay. Peak voltage, we get to about 0. Depolarization abruptly ends, and the membrane enters repolarization, which has 2 components. I mentioned before, the sodium gate has an inactivation gate. So when it gets to these high voltages, the inactivation gate pops in there. When the inactivation gate pops in there, sodium will not move anymore. So sodium is done. So all sodium does is it acts as the depolarization. It gets you from negative 70 to 0. That's it. Now, once we're up in these high voltages, now potassium channels open up. So now potassium is ready to start flowing. And we know potassium is going to go in the opposite direction. Okay, so now we are repolarizing. What does repolarizing mean? Going back towards the resting membrane potential. Okay, so repolarization, is really due to the increase in potassium movement, because at this point, during repolarization, there's no more movement of sodium, because sodium has that inactivation gate in there, and it shuts it off. Then we have a little bit of a after hyperpolarization or a hyperpolarization. It's just because potassium conductance is very strong, so it's